This is the third part of our discussion in SQLite with Android. In our first discussion, we talked about what SQLite is and how it can effectively be used in the Android platform. In our second discussion, which was the last discussion, we looked at how we can take data that we already have, that we've just freshly downloaded from the internet, and store that into a local cache in SQLite. What we're going to take a look at now is how we can select data from SQLite. A quick review of what we did in the last time. We created an onCreate method. One moment, please. This is the third part of our discussion on SQLite. In the first part, we described what SQLite is and how it can be used to effectively create a local copy of data on our phone for performance and online-offline seamless capabilities. In our second discussion, we looked at how we can create a data schema, and we also looked at how we can insert data into the local database by reusing data that we have pulled offline. In this discussion, we're going to look at how we can do some fetch methods to query the database. So first, a little review of what we did. We used this onCreate method to create our database schema. If you take a look here, we have a standard SQL create statement that's creating a table and creating columns in that table. Next, what we did is we used ContentValues to take a list of plant objects and store them into the database. Now, a challenge that we're going to have is that we're inserting data into the database right now, and we don't want to insert duplicates because we're just taking this list of plants and we're inserting those into the database. But it's quite possible if we get the same list of plants again, we're going to try to insert the same plants again. So we don't want to have that duplication. We only want to have one row for each plant in the database. So what we're going to do is we're going to put together a fetch statement that's going to select plants based on a unique identifier, and that way we can check to see if we already have this plant in the database before we add it to the database again. Now what we're going to need to pull data out of the database is a cursor. If you've used JDBC before, this is similar to a result set. It's basically a way that we can grab one row at a time from the database. So we can fetch one row from the database, and I know this is a little bit small. Let me just expand this a little bit. We can fetch one row from the database by checking first to see, okay, how many rows are in this cursor. Hopefully there should be one, especially for selecting by a unique identifier, because the whole point of a unique identifier is it should be unique. That is, it should return exactly one row. Now, within that, we can get values out of this cursor by calling cursor.getInt or cursor.getString, and then we can add those to a new plant object by creating a new plant object like so. This plant equals new plant, and then calling this plant dot set, and use all the setter methods to put data into that plant. Then finally, we can close the cursor and we can return this newly created plant. We might also want to return multiple rows, and if we do that, we'll want to iterate over the cursor. We first move it to first, and then we loop, and after each loop, we move it to next until we're finished. And we'll know we're finished when the cursor goes beyond its last position. We'll take a look at that in just a moment. A quick refresher, in our last lecture, we used something called ContentValues to get data into the database. And with ContentValues, what we would do is we would take a column name, which actually I ended up using a constant, and then we would associate values with that column name. And in these cases, I used getter methods to get those values. And then we simply insert that data finally. We also, in our last lecture, used the SQLite database browser, which is a free tool, which allows us to look at the data in the database. If I look at the plants table, right now we have 12 unique plants. Each one of them is a red bud, a different kind of red bud. If you look at the common name, you'll notice that they're all different. So our goal is that I should be able to search on red, and I'll get things like red maple, and I will get things like red bud because they both have the word red, but I don't want to reinsert any plants that I already have. So what we're going to do is we're going to use the global unique identifier, which is the unique identifier on plantplaces.com, to see if we already have this plant in the database or not. The first ID is something that's automatically generated just on our local SQLite database. That won't do us any good to see if something already exists, because that's just going to insert a new number that's unique only to this local database. What we actually want to do is we want to compare this global identifier, which is actually the primary key from plantplaces.com. So let's take a look. Okay, I will create a method, and we'll call it, let's say private, well, I guess we could make it public plant, because we're going to return one plant at most, since we're going to be sending in a unique identifier. Fetch by GUID. So fetch by global unique identifier, and then we'll accept a parameter, an integer parameter of type ID. And so I'll put some Javadoc here. Of course, that's always a good idea. Fetch a plant by its unique identifier. Okay, ID, the global unique identifier for this plant. Excuse me. Return the plant object that matches this global unique identifier. Okay, so now what we'll do is we want to get rid of red lines as soon as we can. Let me give us a little bit more space here. We want to get rid of red lines as soon as we can, even if that means just making a dummy object. So I'll say plant equals null, return null. Now that should only really be null. We should only really return null. I'm sorry, it should be return plant. We should only really return null if we aren't able to find any results. Okay. Now let me put together a selection statement, and if you recall, we made a bunch of constants that represent this table and all of its columns. So I'm going to say string SQL select equals, and we'll say select. Okay. And now I'm going to say the global unique identifier. Okay. And then a comma, and then a space, and then we'll say genus, and then a comma, and a space, and then species. And these are all of the constants that we've defined up above. I'll make sure they're still there because they're not lighting up. Yeah, they're still there. Say they're not lighting up yet down here. And then a comma, and then we'll say plus cultivar. Okay, and then comma and space. Genus, species, cultivar, and we'll say common. And then plus space. Using constants means we're always reusing the same column and table names, and it's less of a risk of misspelling, because if we misspell the constant name, we'll catch that at compile time. So it's a much more efficient way of writing a query. And of course, there are other ways to write queries as well. Let's see, I don't need a comma on that last item because that's the last thing I'm going to select. And I'll say from, and then after the from, we have the table name, which is going to be, I believe that's plants table. Okay, and then we're going to say, we'll say plus, and let me add a space, where, okay, and that falls off the screen a little bit. Let me just bring this right back over so we can keep it on the screen. Where, let's say GUID, okay, plus, boom, equals, and then whatever ID was passed in, and we're just calling that ID, and then semicolon. And we should be all set at that point. So this is, oh, okay, I'm missing a plus here. So we're saying that we want to select some data out of the database, and this is what a common select statement looks like. If I were to replace this select statement, or if I were to replace all of these constants and make it one string, it would look roughly like this. Select GUID, comma, genus, comma, species, comma, cultivar, comma, common, from plants where GUID equals, for example, 83. So this is roughly what it would look like. And I can test this out using the SQLite database browser. And I see that sure enough, it returns to me one row, and it's the row that has the global unique identifier for 83. Okay, now let's say I pick something where we don't have a global unique identifier that matches, like 8300, and we see nothing gets returned. So that's our expected result. We're either going to get one item returned, or we're going to get 0 items returned. Looks like I'm missing a plus here. So, okay, I think we're good. Okay. Next, what I need to do is I need to run this query. So I'm going to say get readable database. That's a lot to say, so I'm just going to start typing, hold Control and hit space, and let it fill in the blanks for me. And then I'm going to say .raw query. Okay, give it the SQL select statement. Whoops, almost. And then pass in no arguments. We went ahead and just put the arguments in manually ourselves. Let me change that to null, which means I'm not passing in any arguments. So I take the SQL query, pass it in as the first expression, as the first parameter, and then pass in null as the second. I'm going to hold Control and press 1, say assign to new local variable, and we'll just say cursor equals get readable database. So let me put a few comments here on what I'm doing, because it's starting to get a little bit messy. Declare our return value. Okay. Create the SQL selection string that we will run against the database. Okay. And then we'll say get the results in a cursor, which will allow us to read results from the database. Okay, next, we need to iterate over the cursor, but only if we actually have a result. Now, this cursor, lowercase c cursor, has a method called getCount. Okay, and that will tell us how many results that we have. So we're going to say if cursor getCount equal 1. Do we have at least one result? Okay. If we have at least one result, and we really should have only one result, we have found a match for this GUID. Okay. And so what I'm going to do then is I'm going to say cursor dot move to first. Okay, move us to the first line. And then I'm going to say plant equals new plant. So I'm going to say create a new plant object that we can populate. Okay, plant equals new plant, got that. And then I'm going to say plant dot set ID. We'll see the first column we're selecting is the GUID. So for that I can say plant dot set ID cursor dot get int, and then we start counting at 0, so we'll say column index 0. Okay, so we're getting the first item out, which is the global unique identifier. That's an integer, and set ID is expecting an integer, so we're going to say cursor.getInt. Next, I'll say plant.setGenus. Okay, and we'll say cursor. This time we're dealing with a string because a genus is string data, so we'll say cursor.getString1, plant.set species. That's our third column, and since we start counting at 0, it's actually going to be column number 2. So cursor.getString, and we'll say 2. And then we're going to say plant.setCultivar, and we're going to say cursor.getString, because a cultivar is a string, and 3. And then we're going to say plant.setCommon, and we're going to say cursor.getString, and finally 4, the fourth column that we have, and that will populate our plant. And then we simply need to close the cursor. So we say cursor.close, which means we're all done, and it's safe to release it from memory. Let me put another comment here. Populate the plant. Okay, and I'll save. Now, this method is pretty well done, and we're going to want to, of course, step through this one line at a time. So I'm going to snap on a breakpoint. But we also want to call this method. And remember what the trick is. The trick is that we want to call that method before we insert a row to see if we already have that row or not. So within this for loop, in the insert method, I'm going to say check to see if this row exists in the database. If so, skip it. So I'm going to say, what was the name of that method? Fetch by GUID? Fetch by GUID. Okay, and we're going to pass in plant.getID. Okay, and we're simply going to, you know what? We're going to say assign to new local variable, plant, let's say existing plant equals fetch by GUID, plant.getID, and then we're going to say if existing plant equal null, then boom, insert this new plant. What does that mean? If existing plant equal null? Well, remember, if we look here, we're setting the plant to null, and we're only assigning it to something else if we actually got a result. So if we did not get a result, we're returning the plant as a null. We're not returning it as a legitimate populated object. So what we're saying here is, if we did not get results, go ahead and insert. Okay? So let me put a comment to that effect. If we did not get results, insert this plant as a new plant. Otherwise, disregard. Okay? And save. Now at this point what I'll do is we'll go ahead and start the debugger. We'll try a wider search this time, and we will watch to see, are these plants getting inserted? Are they not getting inserted? So we'll set a few more breakpoints here. I will enable a breakpoint here. I'm also going to set a breakpoint within the if test. So breakpoint there as well, and then I'm going to start the debugger. Okay, right click, debug as Android application, and we'll simply give it a moment for it to come up. Okay, looks like we're loaded. Let me just double check, make sure I don't have any. Okay, looks like we're good. I'm going to choose search plants. I know this is a little bit off screen here, so I'll try to bring it down within screen. And again, I'm going to search on a very generic term. I'm going to search on red. Okay, so red, if we look at the liveplantplaces.com, let's do that same search on plantplaces.com. Just one moment as I bring up my browser, which happens to be many, many tabs away. Okay. And I go to plantplaces.com. And we scroll down and we type in red and search. Acer rubrum, red maple, red point maple, red sunset maple, lots of red maples. Red buckeye, an entirely different tree, red horse chestnut, red ginger, red chokeberry. We see there are a lot of plants that have that word red in them. So I'm going to search on red, and we're going to get a list of all the plants that have the word red, which is going to include our red bud and several other plants as well. So allow me to go ahead. We're in the plant results activity. I'm going to play through this, and our goal is to get to the insert plants activity. I'm going to keep playing until I get there. Okay, we're fetching plants from the online data source. This will probably give us a pretty big list back. So let's see. Okay, I will, actually I can probably disable this breakpoint because we're not needing to look at that anymore. I'll F6, F6. So right now we're making the network call. Okay, I'll take just a moment here, make the network call, and get the list of plants back. I'm going to start disabling some of these breakpoints we're not using anymore. So F6, 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 F6. And this is the one that's going to take a little while because it's going to have to fetch all of those results. And it's going to be quite a long list. It's going to be a long It's going to be a long list of JSON text. We return that result, and now it's going to parse this text. We've seen that happen before, so I'm going to disable this breakpoint, and I'm going to choose F7, which will just finish up this method and return from this method. So we'll give that a moment. Okay, and then F6, and let's take a look. Fetch plants is an array list. Let's see if we can get an idea of how many items are here. 90 items are here, but remember 12 of those are duplicates with what we already have. So we're hoping to see some new, and we're hoping not to see any duplicates of the ones that exist. So we're taking this list of 90 plants that contain the word red, okay? Long list of 90 plants that contain the word red, and we're sending it down to our offline plant DAO, and we're telling it we want to save these plants locally. So I'm going to choose F5, and I'm going to step into this offline plant DAO. Okay, and now what we're going to do is we're going to iterate over these plants, and we're going to see what happens. Okay, I choose F6, choose F6 again. Okay, the first thing we're going to run is we're going to look at this plant's global unique identifier. I highlight that expression. Control-Shift-I will tell me that the global unique identifier is 1872. Okay, I'm going to go back to my SQLite database browser, and I'm going to look at 1872 and see if we have a plant for 1872, which I don't think we do. And sure enough, it shows no data returned. So this should be a new plant. So let me F5 in. Okay, and this is going to take us, let's see, I'll F7 back and F5 one more time to fetch by GUID. Okay, so we're expecting that we're not going to see any data from this. And by the way, I'm going to set a breakpoint on line 84 for when we do see data. We're expecting we're not going to see any data. We're also hoping that I have used the correct syntax in this statement, which I'm going to double check right now just to make sure. And I think we're good. Okay, I choose F6. Now it's going to run that statement. I'm going to cross my fingers and hold my breath. Hopefully it runs properly. And we're going to see, did we get results? No results. Okay, because we got no results, we're expecting that this is going to return a null object for plant. If I mouse over, we're going to see null. Okay, so I F6 and I F6 and we see existing plant is null because it wasn't able to find results. Is null equal to null? Sure enough it is. So we're going to go ahead and insert this as a brand new plant. Okay, we're going to insert this as a brand new plant because this is probably one of those maples. Let's see if we can find out what it is. Looks like it's the Acer rubrum red maple, which is not a red bud, so it's not a plant that we currently have in our database. So I continue to F6, and we insert this new record. Now, I don't want to step through manually 90 different records. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to disable some of the breakpoints that we have so far, like the one that starts this loop. And I'm also going to disable the one where we are inserting a new plant. And I'm going to choose play. Okay. The next breakpoint to come up is our fetch by GUID. So we're now looking for plant number 1327. I'm going to go ahead and disable this breakpoint as well. And I'm going to choose play. And as I choose play, we're going to wait to see if it finds a plant we already have. And sure enough, it's gone through and it's found a plant that we already have. And the plant happens to be plant number 83, which we actually already looked at. But just for memory, let's look at plant number 83 again. So again, I told the debugger to keep running, keep acting normally until it finds a plant that already exists. And here we go. Plant number 83, we're saying that already exists. So what I'm doing is I'm creating a new plant object and I'm populating it with data from the database for this plant number 83. There we go, plant number 83. Okay, populating it with data from plant number 83. As a matter of fact, let's see when it finishes. Okay, if all works well, I'm going to go down to our plant object here in the Variables tab, and we'll see that this is the eastern redbud, genus Cercis, ID 83, and species canadensis. If we look in our SQLite browser, Cercis canadensis, eastern redbud, sure enough, there we go. Okay, and we close the cursor. Okay, and we return, instead of returning null, we're returning now a populated plant. Okay, so let's take a look. Existing plant should not be null, it should be a populated plant. And sure enough, we see it is the Cercis canadensis eastern redbud. It's a populated plant. Now, is a populated plant equal to null? No, it's not equal to null. So we're going to skip this entire part where we insert data. We're going to skip that, and we're going to move on to the next plant. Okay, now at this point, I'm going to go ahead and let this play through. Okay, I'm going to turn off all the breakpoints, and I'm going to let this play through, and there we go. And then I'll go back to our emulator, and in a moment the emulator should show all of the 90 plant results that we have. And sure enough, there we go. All kinds of plants that have the word red in them. Red aloe, red ginger, red chokeberry, Chinese red birch. Now what's important is we want to make sure that we have all 90 of these plants, but we also want to make sure that we have not duplicated any of the red buds that we already have. So let's remember how we can look at this database. I'm going to go to the DDMS tab in Eclipse, and the database is going to be in the sandbox for our application. So I'm going to expand on the data folder, one more time. I'm going to look for the package that represents our app, which is COM example FS13 1046 plant places. I'm going to go to databases, and I'm going to grab this plantplaces.db. Then I'm going to hover over this pull a file from the device. I'm going to click, and I'm going to save it. Let's see, I think I already have a plantplaces.db. So let's save this as something new. Let's see, do we have, what do we have? We'll save it as plantplaces1.db. It really doesn't matter too much. And then I'm going to choose save. So this is the latest copy of the database which lives on the emulator phone. Okay, I'm going to choose open, and now we're going to go and I'm going to look for that plantplaces 1.db, and we're going to choose open, and don't need to save changes to the existing. Okay, and give it a moment to render. Okay, I'm going to look at plants, and we see a whole bunch more results now. I'm going to go to execute SQL, and remember last time we had about 12 records. I'm going to go to execute SQL. First of all, I'm going to copy that into my buffer so I can remember it. Select count star from plants will tell us how many rows we have in the plants table. We have 71 rows. Okay, now let's see if we have duplicates for this GUID 83, which is a plant that we already had previously. Whoops, Control Z, sorry. Okay, I'm going to choose execute query, and we see success. We only got one row back, which is important. So we had this row 83 before, we had one of them, and now we still have only one. So we see it was able to filter out duplicate rows, which is good. So in this lecture, what have we talked about? Let's go back to offline plant DAO. We looked at what a select statement looks like in SQL. Looks a lot like this statement right here, but we used our constants so that we could reuse the same column names and table names. We saw that to run a query, we need to get a reference to the readable database, which we do by calling a method. We call raw query, and we pass in the SQL statement that we wish to run. That's going to return a cursor. For the cursor, we're going to say if we got at least one result, let's move to that first result, instantiate a plant object, populate that plant object, and then close the cursor. Because there's no else part to this if test, if we did not get one result, we must have gotten 0 results. If we got 0 results, we return an all plant. If we got 1 result, we return the plant that we populated right here. Our search term is this global unique identifier that we're passing in as a method parameter. So we can combine this with the insert logic we had before, where we iterate over a collection of plant data. We fetch it by this global unique identifier. If we got a result, we don't do anything. If we did not get a result, then our existing plant variable is null, and then we're going to insert the plant on this iteration. Okay, so that way we avoid getting any duplicates. So that's good for our first look at doing select statements with SQL. In our next exercise, what we're going to do is we're going to try to do an online-offline toggle, and we'll also see how we can use this local database to populate a drop-down and autocomplete text for us, which will help us to simplify the user's experience by making helpful suggestions based on what the user is typing. Thank you.